carbon and climate, this could be a little bit controversial. It has been quite controversial in Australia. In 2007, I was very, very concerned about the way agriculture was going in Australia and thought that really the best thing that we could probably do would be to incentivise farmers to build soil carbon. Because, as I'll explain in a moment, it's the one single measurable factor that's actually linked to everything else that we want in healthy soil: soil structure, nutrients, status, water holding capacity, landscape function, human health, you name it. It's all linked to soil health, but how do you measure soil health? Well, soil carbon is a really good measure of soil health. So I stupidly, not realising how stupid I was at the time, decided I talked to the federal government about it. They didn't want to know about it, and I said, well, I'll do it myself. Do the little red hen thing, no one's going to help me, so I'll do it myself. I found another woman who was willing to help me, and she happened to be a multi-millionaire, and she said that she was very concerned. I didn't have any money, but I had a great idea, right? And she had the money, but and she lived in Singapore, and she was buying farmland in Australia. And her idea was that if there was a system for incentivising farmers, like paying them for soil carbon, and she bought all these farms that were very degraded, very deteriorated soil, and built the soil carbon in those, that she could be rewarded like further down the track. So there was some incentive in her for initiating a soil carbon payment scheme, so that when the federal government got the idea of how to do it, I mean, how stupid was that, thinking that if you showed them how to do it, that they would actually adopt the idea? But anyway, that further down the track, she'd actually get paid, so she'd get her money back. So she agreed, and we put some money in the bank. So this was going to pay farmers $25 a tonne for the carbon that they sequestered in their soil. And I called it the Australian Soil Carbon Accreditation Scheme. I mean, boy, was I really setting myself up for failure. So the Australian Soil Carbon Accreditation Scheme, launched by a woman, on her own, working without a group or anything, just a woman and someone who was going to finance it, which happened to be another woman. Probably two mistakes, right? So we very bravely launched this, and we had some wonderful farmers came on board, and I had some great help from people who owned equipment to collect soil cores, and we went around the countryside and we collected thousands of soil cores and sent them off to the laboratory and got them all analysed and everything. And we proved that these farmers, through changing their land management practices, built soil carbon. And so we made a big announcement that we were now going to pay them, and we were going to give them soil carbon incentive payments. And the federal government said, you can't do that. You can't give them soil carbon incentive payments because we have ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol says these are the procedures for measuring soil carbon and doing all those things. So I had, again, stupidly gone out. We had measured soil carbon to 110 centimetres, which is, well, 100 centimetres is about 40 inches, so more than 40 inches down into the soil. Well, the Kyoto Protocol says that you can only measure the top 30 centimetres, which is the top 12 inches of soil. In other words, they didn't even think plant roots went beyond that. But they were not thinking about plant roots because they were thinking that soil carbon comes from adding organic matter to the soil, which we now know that's not really the pathway. The soil carbon comes from exudates from plant roots that are then reprocessed by microbes that turn that labile carbon that comes out of plant roots into a stable form in the soil. So there's a lot of reprocessing that goes on, and it all depends on how deep the roots are and how much exudate's coming out of them. And so if you've got roots that go deeper than 30 centimetres, which your perennial grasses will have, for example, then you can build a lot of carbon below 30 centimetres. So we basically did it all wrong, and we're not able to, even though we measured it, we had farmers who achieved it. So we proved that they could do it, that we could measure it, but it wasn't under the terms of the Kyoto Protocol that our government had ratified, and we're not allowed to use that word carbon, the C word. I don't know what it is about that word, but you start trying to introduce that into any policy and you'll get yourself into all kinds of trouble. So then we said, oh, well, we were going to call it something else. In the end, this went on and on and on, and in the end we decided that we would call we still paid the farmers, and we awarded soil restoration leadership awards, and we called these the soil leaders, and awarded soil restoration leadership awards. So I can tell you that the carbon story can be a very troubled one, and it's probably something that we need to figure about, like how to get around it. So I think the great thing about healthy soil, talking about healthy soil, what you really are talking about is soil carbon, but no one seems to mind that word healthy soil, and we all want healthy soil because it's like linked to healthy plants and healthy animals, healthy people, and it doesn't cause any issues. In fact, people get excited about healthy soil, where as soon as you start talking about carbon, you immediately polarise the entire audience, and ditto with climate change. So now I'm putting carbon and climate change together in the one talk, so hopefully I'll leave here alive. But soil organic carbon is the one single measurable factor that does tell us the most about soil health, and this is a slide I use over and over, and I see it in other people's presentations too, so they must like it, which is good. So, it's the key factor for the water holding capacity. We've talked about how that worked, and the key driver for the nutritional status of plants, and therefore of animals and people, and for those reasons it's going to be the key driver for farm profit. So really, in the absence of any kind of incentive schemes, if people can manage land in a way that increases soil carbon, it will reduce your inputs and it will improve your profitability, so that there is a financial incentive for doing it anyway, just in terms of farming is going to be more profitable for you, whether it comes through another agency or whether it's just from your own revenue. So unfortunately, the soil carbon content of most farm soils is now 50 to 80% less than the original level, and by original level I mean prior to European settlement in most situations. And we are still seeing a very rapid decline in cropland in soil carbon levels, which is a bit of a worry. The 30% of the world's cropland has been abandoned, just even in the last 40 years, due to soil decline, and it's still being abandoned at the rate of 25 million acres a year. So I've got this incredible reduction in the productive capacity of the world's crop soils, farm soils, and a rapid increase in the world's population that sort of doesn't really, and this is why people become very pessimistic about the future, unless we turn things around, especially in terms of our soils. So why is it that cropland is still deteriorating, even though we have a lot of knowledge about soils? And the main thing is that 50% of it is bare. So the statistics show that in any 12-month period, 50% of the world's croplands, I'm talking globally now, are bare. Now, those of you who travel a lot, if any of you fly a lot, like just flying over the United States at any time of the year, unless everything's covered in snow and you can't really see it, you'll see an incredible amount of bare ground in the farmland. Under the pivots and other places, it just blows me away every time. So on this most recent trip that I've been on, one of the places I was in Oregon. Now at this time of the year, I was in Portland, Oregon. It's mild. It hardly ever goes below freezing, if ever. I'm not sure whether it does. It's moist. And 75% of all the farmland there was bare. I can understand in some other parts of the United States it's too cold to grow anything in winter, but the ground should still be covered. But in some parts of it, where it would be possible to grow plants, it's still bare. So people just don't seem to really get it about photosynthesis and about bare soil, about having to have living plants. So I think this is one of the reasons where our soils are going, backwards. So, we used to think that disturbance was the problem. So in Australia we went to mid-till, zero-till, direct-till. All those names basically mean the same thing in Australia. And we had a very high adoption rate. We probably had some of the highest adoption of any country in the world. And we've been practising zero-till now for, since the 70s. By the 80s and 90s, there was a very large proportion of Australian farms were zero-till. And where's the photosynthesis? Our soil carbon levels are still going backwards in our zero-till, because it wasn't about the cultivation, it was about the lack of plants. And we just, instead of cultivating it like we did before, we spray it now. So we're putting all those chemicals into the environment, and there'll be things like just about everyone's urine sample has got atrazine and glyphosate in it, and all these chemicals that we're using to maintain this as a plant-free environment. So this soil is still going to go backwards. So we've actually caused, in Australia, I can just even limit this to Australia, that we have caused an increase in the frequency and the severity of droughts in our country through inappropriate land management, and I don't think that there's any doubt about that. If we look at this globally and look at lands all around the world where there's been a big change in the appearance of the landscape since European settlement, on the left-hand side there you have healthy soil because it's covered with living plants. Like I was talking about Australia in the 1800s, where even in a hot, dry summer in a Mediterranean type climate, it was green because it was a hydrated landscape, because there was lots of carbon in the soil. So we found all kinds of amazing ways to destroy that green ground cover. We either overgrazed it, or we burned it, or we cultivated it, and then more recently we sprayed it. And I mean, isn't it funny how we just want to kill plants and kill plants and kill plants, and you can't let anything green. If we have a rainfall event in a summer fallow period in Australia, there's what was called a green alert. We'll go out now, everyone will get it on their phones. An SMS will come out, it's a green alert. It's rain, get out there and spray anything green that grows in your fallow, because you've got to keep it there. So as soon as we lose ground cover, the next frame, it says NPP decrease, so that's net primary production. As I said, burn it, overgraze it, cultivate it, spray it, whatever. As soon as you lose net primary production, the next frame is soil organic carbon decrease. You are going to lose carbon if you don't have plants growing in your soil. And then the final frame, soil moisture decrease. As soon as you lose soil carbon, you're going to lose soil moisture. So what was one of the reasons we fallowed soil for in Australia? What was one of the reasons that the green alert goes out and everyone goes out and sprays their fallows? So this, if I just go back to that one, rains, green things come up in there, everyone will spray it. Why are they doing that? Because they think that this is storing moisture. They're told that this is storing moisture. And I guess, yeah, you could think maybe if there was green things growing there, they might use some moisture. But in actual fact, you don't want to lose moisture from your land from evaporation. You want to lose it through transpiration, because it's only a tiny amount goes through transpiration. So that one on the left where we have got green plants is not losing anywhere near as much moisture as the one on the right where we've got huge amounts of evaporation. So transpiration through living plants is never going to be as much as evaporation from bare soil. While ever you're losing moisture through evaporation, you're losing profit. When you've got moisture moving through transpiration, you're making money. So you're losing money when it goes through evaporation, you're making money when it goes from transpiration. So we need to move everything back to the left-hand side there in order to, really have a huge impact on the climate, because when we have all that moisture going up into the atmosphere, water vapour is the greenhouse gas that has increased to the greatest extent since the Industrial Revolution, and the impact of water vapour on our climate is huge. You can't see it, it's an invisible gas, you can't smell it, but there's massive amounts of it. So all of these things lead into desertification, aridification, temperature warming. You know, our human activities have had a huge effect on the climate. Our human activities, in as far as they relate to land management, have had a huge impact on the climate. I'll talk about CO2 in a little minute. So, just to give you an example of this kind of effect, I was going to say something about rabbits in Australia. About 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago now, someone got the bright idea of bringing some rabbits into Australia for hunting purposes. They didn't have any natural predators. They increased very, very rapidly and caused massive degradation of the vegetation. They ate just about everything in sight. There were rabbit plagues. They used to have rabbit drives where people went out and just moved all of the rabbits like into one corner of a paddock and then shot them all. But there would just be thousands and thousands of rabbits. You can look it up on Google, you can go back and see some of the photographs. So in Western Australia, if you look at a map of the Australian continent, so I live over on the eastern side, that's where Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria are. And then the other half of the continent is called Western Australia. It's kind of like if you draw a line down the middle, almost half of Australia is Western Australia. And there's big deserts in between. So to get from Eastern Australia over to Western Australia, you have to cross the desert. So the people in Western Australia didn't have the rabbits yet, and they decided to put a rabbit-proof fence up to try and stop them from coming into Western Australia. But the interesting thing about the rabbit-proof fence was that you were only allowed to farm on the western side of it. They said this will be the limit to where you can convert native vegetation into farmland, because we're going to protect all that farmland that's on the western side of that fence. We've got this rabbit-proof fence, and you're only allowed to farm on that western side of it. You're not allowed to farm on the other side. Well, it's amazing that the rabbit-proof fence actually changed the climate, because on one side we had farmland and on the other side we had native vegetation. So this is what happened with the rabbit-proof fence. A bit hard for me to show you without a pointer, but if you look at the screen you'll see a red line there and some red writing that says rabbit-proof fence, right? So on the left-hand side of that will be the ocean. You can see some land and then the ocean. Like to the far left is the ocean, that's the Indian Ocean. On the right-hand side of that line it says scrubland, and it says scrubland with clouds. So in actual fact, can you see there's a line, this is a satellite photo, see the lines of the clouds are actually following that fence. It rains more on the eastern side of the rabbit-proof fence than it does on the western side, and yet the eastern side is the desert side. The other side is the coastal side, which should really have, the rainfall gets higher as you go towards the coast, right? So it should actually be higher on the western side than on the eastern side. So there's been a lot of articles and there's a lot of science around this. If anybody was interested in it, I can send you some more. So this is how you fence out the climate. It's a really interesting phenomenon that to see this relationship between the amount of vegetation cover and what actually happens in terms of climate. And of course, if we go back to this diagram here, and we look at places like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Kansas, like etc., 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 where we have hugely changed the amount of vegetative cover in the last 200 years. Of course, we are going to have a huge impact on the climate. We can't not. So what about our rangelands? I'm sure many of you are aware in this room that they're not as well managed as they could be, but we're seeing big changes there, which is great. And those of us in Australia can't really point the finger at you, because this photograph was taken about a month, well, January the 19th. What's the date today? The 14th. So like 3 weeks ago, this photo was taken in Australia. This is a massive dust storm that's rolling across the country from our rangelands. This is not anything to do with cropping. It's not like the Dust Bowl era that was like linked to soil disturbance. There hasn't been any crop production in this region where this dust is coming from. It's our rangelands region that we still have not figured out. So what does the government do when we have a drought? They supply money to landholders to buy hay and keep animals on that land, instead of incentivising people or supporting people to get animals off that land and maintain their ground cover. If they've got hay, they'll stay there and they'll graze every last leaf until there is nothing. And then when it does rain, which it did, now it's flooding, so you can see the clouds. We've got these massive dust storms, and then it started to rain. So if there are animals still on that land, they're going to graze those new plants, any plants that have survived that try to regrow before they can produce a good root system. I mean, you couldn't have a more perverse outcome. I can understand that people are trying to support farmers by providing hay, but it's the worst thing that you would want to do in a drought. We really have to incentivise people to get animals off the land and to understand the importance of keeping the ground cover that's there to stop this kind of thing from happening. So we haven't learnt much about rangeland management, unfortunately, in Australia. So if we look globally, there's about 1.5 billion hectares of cropland, which we are seeing big changes in terms of, cover crops and minimum till. And we've got 3.5 billion hectares of rangelands. So we effectively have twice as much land, more than double the amount. Rangeland is more than double the amount of cropland. So, most of you in this room, I'm sure, are very familiar with rangeland management and really positive changes that we can make in the rangelands. So I think even if we just looked at the rangelands and changing the management on those, improving the growth of the vegetation, improving the amount of ground cover, improving the soil so that we have better infiltration. In other words, restoring the water cycle on rangeland, I believe, could have a huge impact on global climate. So the potential in the rangelands is huge. And harvesting rainfall, of course, requires that we have deep roots and appropriate grazing management. I'm sure you've all seen this diagram that's used in every second presentation here in the United States, but what it's showing is that, in so far as when you are grazing plants, is not to allow livestock to graze them too short, because then they will have a big impact on the roots, and then it does take plants a long time to regrow. And the other thing about that is that if you take a plant, any kind of plant, a forage plant, and cut it in half, and you keep the top half separate to the bottom half, and you might do that to, like, say, 20 plants of the same species, just so that you've got a good representative sample. You send that off to the lab to have a tissue test or a leaf test or whatever you call it in this country. You'll find that the top half of the plant has double the energy, double the protein, double the minerals, double the trace elements to the bottom half. So when you bring animals into a new pasture, they will just very quickly skim the top half off all the plants. And then if you leave them in there for longer, they'll come back and eat the bottom half. So it's not, people say, well, how do you get animals just to eat 50% of the plants? But you watch them, they will just take the top 50% off, because that's their average daily gain, their productivity will be much, much higher, and they're going to be much healthier if they do that. If you leave them in longer and they take the bottom half, then it's not as good for them, they don't grow as fast, and also it impacts on the root system of those plants. So if we have short roots, of course, then we're not building deep soil, we're not getting good water infiltration. And the other thing about the bare ground, like if we have grazed it right down to the ground level like that, or even grazed it to the point, and then if it's regrazed and it dies and then we've got completely bare ground, is that that is the thing in the way I look at the world. It is bare ground is the really big issue that we have to try and deal with. When we're talking about climate, why on earth are we worried about a trace gas? Can someone tell me what percentage of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide?
450 parts per million.
Which is, as a percentage, is?
0.04.
0.04%. When you look at the amount of bare ground on this planet that we've created through inappropriate land management, and the effect that we know that has on the water cycle, and I'm going to talk about temperature and the heat dome effect and all kinds of other things, and we talk about a trace gas that's 0.04% of the atmosphere, and we think that that is changing the climate. That is one of the most extraordinary myths that I have ever come across in my lifetime. I find it absolutely unbelievable that we can think that way. So just to go back to our this scenario of how things have changed over time, if we go to the fourth frame there, where we've reduced the ground cover, we've increased soil moisture loss, evapotranspiration is going through the roof if there's any moisture left to evaporate, and then we create a heat dome as well on that soil surface. So what happens with the heat dome, we'll go back to that diagram, just imagine that it's 100 degree day, and we're out there on some bare ground. So the ambient air temperature is 100 degrees. If you use a thermometer to measure the soil temperature, can someone tell me, Daniel, you're allowed to answer this question. What do you think the soil surface temperature might go up to on a 100 degree day on bare ground? 160? 140? All right, we'll go with 140. It can go up to 160. I have seen measurements. Well, let's we'll go 150, right? So, any take us on that. So the ambient temperature is 100. The bare soil will heat up to 150. And I mean, if you don't realise how hot bare soil is, take your shoes off. You can actually totally scald the bottoms of you can get like 3rd-degree burns or something on the bottoms of your feet walking on bare ground on a hot summer's day. It is, in fact, if you cracked an egg on it, you would fry it, right? So it's 150 degrees. What do you think that's like for anything living in the soil, like microbes? Okay, now if we covered it with something, cover crop, ambient temperature 100,
75.
thank you, 75, that sounds like a good number. All right, but let's just go back to the bare ground. So the ambient temperature is 100. We've got bare ground. It is going to heat the air just above it. So let's say it's 150 degrees on the surface of the bare soil. So that air, what happens to air when you heat it? It rises, right? Just like in the diagram there. And if there's any moisture in there, it's going to take that with it. What happens if you put a pot of water on the stove and heat it up? It evaporates, right? So that hot air is going to take any moisture that's there with it, and then this other air that's 100 degrees is going to race in there and fill that gap, because this air's rising, taking moisture, this air's coming in, and what happens when the 100 degree air hits the 150 degree soil surface? It heats up to 150 degrees and it rises and more air comes in. So you create a heat dome by having bare ground. If the ambient temperature is 100 degrees, you make it much, much worse by having bare ground compared to having our covered soil. Farmers should, if they're ever going to be paid for anything, it should be for covering their soil, because it has effects on so many processes, including even the temperature. We're talking about global warming. Didn't I say 50% of the Earth's cropland, like globally, is bare in any 12-month period? What effect do you think that has on the temperature? So here's an actual example that came from Jonathan Cobb, some of you may know, in Texas. So the ambient temperature, he measured this and he sent me this data on an email. Ambient temperature was 105, soil surface in a bare field was 155, and beneath a warm season multi-species cover crop on his own land but in an adjacent field, 77 degrees. So that was actual, he sent me photographs of the thermometer that he was using and actual changes in temperature. So this kind of thing has an enormous effect on, yes, local temperature, but then that becomes regional, and of course it feeds into global temperatures as well. And it results in increased evaporation. I think I mentioned that in my previous presentation, but this is just an example from Australia. This is not cropland. This is grazing land in our very flat plains areas. So the one on the left has been managed in such a way as to retain ground cover, and the one on the right has just been slightly overgrazed. And you can see that when it rains, the water's not infiltrating. That water has got nowhere to go and it's just going to evaporate. As soon as the sun comes out, we're going to lose that moisture. So bare ground hugely increases the amount of evaporation. And as I said, water vapour is the greenhouse gas that has increased to the greatest extent since the Industrial Revolution. So since the Industrial Revolution, we have all this mechanisation that we didn't have before that's enabled us to bear a whole lot more soil that we weren't able to bear before we had machines. So when we just had horses and or we had to do it by hand, we were limited in the amount of area that could be left there. Now we've got tractors that can do it, ploughs that can do it, chemicals that can do it. We've got all these tools that are at our disposal since the Industrial Revolution that create bare ground. So that bare ground has resulted in increased water vapour, and it has increased hugely compared to the other so-called greenhouse gases. It accounts for 95% of the greenhouse effect, and if you look at the graphically at the greenhouse gases, so this one, oops, sorry, I'm pointing, but the one on the left-hand side, it says water vapour underneath it, 95%, right, of the greenhouse effect, and then the next one's going along, we've got carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then miscellaneous gases. So we're putting all of this emphasis on carbon dioxide when really it's got virtually nothing to do with carbon dioxide. So water vapour.
Do you disagree with the International Climate Change Council and all of their research?
Absolutely. What research? No, truly, what research? There is none.
I'm glad to know where you stand
It's
on
an
science.
opinion. There is no research.
It's silly to have this argument here. But
Okay, it is silly to have this argument
You
here.
got 97% of the scientists in the climate scientists in the world who disagree with you.
97% of scientists in the world agree that humans were having an impact on climate change. I agree. humans are having a massive impact on the climate. That's what 97% of scientists agree that humans were having. And we're in the Anthropocene era. Humans have had a massive impact on just about everything on this planet, including the climate. 97% of scientists did not agree that CO2 had anything to do with it. We need to go back and recheck that. So at most, 4% of the carbon dioxide in the air results from the burning of fossil fuels, and as we said, CO2 constitutes 0.04% of the atmosphere. So the biggest effect that we can possibly have is 4% of 0.04%. But if you do the math, that is the biggest effect that we can possibly have. So if we're serious about reversing climate change, then we need to put the water back in the soil where it belongs, because what we have is a broken water cycle. And I don't think there would be anybody working in natural resources that would not agree that we have a broken water cycle. But what is the way to fix that? Well, we have to fix the carbon cycle. Because when we manage our land in a way to have better ground cover, a greater diversity of plants, when we manage them to be as green for as much of the year as possible, which means they're also going to be as nutritious, the highest nutrition value for our livestock, and more profitable for farmers. Like, everybody wins from restoring carbon in the soil. It is all about carbon, but it's about carbon in the soil. And that is what is going to restore our water cycle, and that is what is going to restore climatic stability. Because the big issues we see with climate at the moment is massive changes from extended dry periods, like longer than normal, and then massive rainfall events with higher intensity. So everything's getting longer gaps between rainfall and then rainfall more intense. Like, many areas of the world are experiencing that. It's a broken water cycle, which is a result of inappropriate land management. So if we change land management practices, and there's a lot of knowledge in this room about how to change land management practices, you know, we've learned so much. There's so much experience here. There's so many great, there are so many great examples even within this room of people who have changed land management practices and seen for themselves an improvement in the water cycle on their own land. That is how we'll improve climatic stability, and as well as increasing our resilience to climatic extremes. So there is so much we can do about the climate. I'm incredibly hopeful about it. Changing our light globes, it's not going to do anything. Electric cars, probably not going to do anything. You know, we have invested so much thought and time and technology into doing something about CO2. Yes, we have to do something about pollution. Like, oftentimes CO2 is linked to massive amounts of pollution. If you look at the coal industry and other sorts of places where there are CO2, like CO2 itself is it's invisible. And what's the other word? Like, when something doesn't smell, doesn't have any. Anyway, you can't. It's totally harmless. It's totally innocuous, and in fact, none of us would be here if we didn't have CO2. We have to have CO2 in the atmosphere in order for plants to be able to photosynthesize, and for all of us to benefit from that photosynthesis through the things that we eat. And also, during photosynthesis, plants create oxygen. Of course, in previous times where this planet has been far more productive than it is at the moment, in other words, like, for example, the Carboniferous era, when dinosaurs roamed the planet, etc., like, the CO2 level was many thousand times higher. It has in fact been 7,000 times higher, I think, than it is at the moment. Historically, in geological timescales, it's extremely low. It could probably do with being a little bit higher than it is at the moment. So it's land management that we need to look at, and that's it for that presentation.